With Halloween finally here, I thought it was finally time to tackle this video. In general, I'm not really a horror movie kind of guy, and it takes a very special kind to suck me in. I can't stand slasher and gore movies and not hugely into schlock horror, so you won't see any of the stereotypical horror movies in this video. For me, I love anything that's psychological, paranormal, or natural. Anything that plays with you on an emotional level, messes with your brain, and makes you afraid of everyday life. To me, that is real horror. And while some of my picks may be a little unconventional or unusual, these are the movies which have frightened me most over the years and which I've come to love as my top 10 horror movies of all time. Let's get into it. Kicking us off at number 10, White Noise. Michael Keaton delivers one of my favourite performances of his as a man so distraught by the sudden death of his wife that he begins meddling with EVP, the real-life electronic voice phenomenon, in which disembodied voices and apparitions of the dead can supposedly contact a living via television and radio static. After successfully contacting her, he becomes so obsessed with EVP that he pushes his limits and eventually opens himself to malevolent spirits. There are some huge, cheap jump scares in here that never fail to get me every single time, as well as some pretty terrifying, bone-chilling psychological moments. It's also a lot of fun and highly enjoyable. To me, all great horror movies leave you with some kind of permanent mark, and this movie's lasting effect on me has been one very simple thing. The slightest glimpse of white noise on the TV or radio is enough to leave me petrified. At number 9, Poltergeist. Poltergeist was officially directed by Tobe Hooper, but Hollywood legend says that the film's producer and screenwriter Steven Spielberg was actually the true director on set. Poltergeist certainly has that 70s, 80s Spielberg feel, which is most likely why I love it so much. The visuals, the cinematography, and the overall construction of the flick are so inarguably Spielberg-esque. Poltergeist tells of a family whose house becomes invaded by spirits who at first seem friendly, harmlessly moving objects around, but eventually become malicious, kidnapping the family's youngest child. As a PG movie, Poltergeist isn't exactly terrifying. A lot of the movie's scares and spirits are highly exaggerated, leading to an exciting adventures in a Close Encounters kind of way. The film's finale is so frenetic, hair-raising, and unforgettable though, that you simply can't look away. If nothing else, Poltergeist makes you afraid to be in the safest place of all, your own home. At number 8, The Conjuring. Quite possibly one of the scariest movies ever, The Conjuring is one of the very few traditional horror movies that I just absolutely love. I've watched this movie numerous times and find myself highly engrossed and terrified every single time. The Conjuring focuses on the supposed real-life investigations of paranormal investigators and demonologists, the Warrens, with the setting of the first installment being a haunted farmhouse. The movie's scares are mostly psychological, but it also has some of the best jump scares I've ever seen, none of which ever really come off as corny or cheap. Regardless what kind, there are scares at every corner. What I love most of all about The Conjuring is that it doesn't just focus on setting up an intensely unsettling atmosphere, but because it does it while also telling a really great story with fantastic characters. To nail a genre is one thing, but to additionally give as much love to the story elements is something I find quite rare, especially when it comes to horrors. At number 7, The Sixth Sense. Part horror, part psychological thriller, The Sixth Sense is my personal favourite of M. Night Shyamalan's films. Haley Joel Osment delivers a terrific performance as a kid who can see dead people, and Bruce Willis, his psychiatric mentor, delivers one of his greatest roles. Sixth Sense is a movie with a continuously bubbling atmosphere, which takes psychological horror to new heights, gradually building its way towards one of the most startling finales and twists in cinema history, one piece of intensity at a time. It's a technique that works so well and creates a nervous energy that keeps you on the edge of your seat for the entire runtime. The way Shyamalan crafted and layered this movie with clever clues and foreshadowing that you never quite notice until repeat viewings is spectacular and one of the best examples of a movie with lingering suspense. At number 6, The Bride of Frankenstein. Arguably the best of the classic Universal Monsters films, and perhaps the greatest classic horror and sequel ever made. Bride of Frankenstein captures all the heart and soul of the original movie, and somehow manages to add new layers of heart-wrenching emotion with some of the most captivating and intense sequences in any movie ever. Held together by an incredibly somber yet poignant story and an outstanding, emotionally charged performance from Boris Karloff, Bride becomes one of the very few incredibly beautiful and heartwarming horror films. But despite that, it still remains riveting, chilling, and legitimately frightening with its striking gothic design and overall gloomy atmosphere. On a technical level, the movie is absolutely superb, and I believe it still holds up today as a worthy horror movie. Yet at number 5, it's Dracula. Dracula, on the other hand, is my personal favourite of the Universal monster flicks, and much like Bride, it remains as spooky and chilling as I'm sure it was the day it was released. This is easily the most atmospheric movie I have ever watched, with enormous lavish sets, dimly lit petrifying low-key cinematography, and a soundtrack which consists of no music, creating such an unnerving and uncomfortable ambience in the entire picture. Bela Lugosi's portrayal of Dracula is unnerving, and David Banner's John Harker is disturbing. The movie is also filled with creepy yet iconic iconography which I absolutely adore. Dracula doesn't rely on big jump scares, violence, or shock value to terrify its audience, doing it on a purely psychological level and acting as one of the earliest examples of a psychological horror. Dracula is an impeccable film which perfectly exhibits all the hallmarks of a great horror movie, and it continues to impact the genre today. At number 4, Jaws. A mix between a monster movie and a natural horror. Jaws frightens us with a real-life threat of the unknown, making it arguably one of the most frightening horror movies of them all. No, Jaws doesn't focus on spirits or actual monsters, but on a real-life, giant, man-eating shark terrorizing a small town. While not overly scary in the regular sense, Jaws is gripping and highly suspenseful with spectacular direction by Steven Spielberg, who uses classic horror techniques to frighten the audience not by what they see, but by what they don't see, with the film's shark barely showing itself until the final act. While the effects and the shark itself are a little dated by today's standards, the terror still remains, as the picture has quite literally made generations of moviegoers afraid of getting back into the water, unknowing what could lie beneath the surface. At number 3, Black Swan. Natalie Portman delivers her greatest performance yet in her Academy Award-winning role of a ballet performer preparing to take on the lead role in Swan Lake. So hell-bent on perfecting her craft, she quickly drives herself into a psychotic hell and an ultimate mental breakdown. This is a movie which is just so perfectly pieced together from the perspective of the lead character, moving at such a frightening and bewildering speed that you too feel like you are on the edge of a breakdown. Black Swan plays tricks with your head and leaves you perplexed about what you're even watching, right until it all clicks into place and finally lets you out of its grip in its euphoric terminal breath. Easily one of the most unsettling and disturbing movies I have ever watched, Black Swan is my favourite movie of the last decade, and I constantly find myself seduced and absorbed in its darkly swirling trance. Never really packaging itself as a horror on the outside, at its core, this is psychological horror at its best. At number 2, Psycho. The seminal film from Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense, Psycho tells of a disturbed, mild-mannered murderer running a motel and living in the adjacent gothic house with his dear mother. Psycho is so perfectly crafted that Hitchcock practically created the formula for the modern horror with it, fashioning narrative and visual tropes that would be long imitated and pushing the boundaries of blood, gore, and nudity in cinema. In fact, the film was shot in black and white, as the censors and audiences would have found the famous shower scene too graphic if it was shown in colour. Nevertheless, black and white cinematography was used to an advantage, employing classic low-key lighting to create an atmosphere of unease and dread, with every exaggerated shadow and camera angle triggering some kind of primal fear in the audience. Anthony Perkins' terrifying performance as Norman Bates also creates an unsettling atmosphere in yet another film whose suspense slowly builds throughout, ending with a spectacular climax. And finally, as my number 1 horror movie of all time, The Shining. The first time I watched The Shining, I was absolutely petrified throughout, haunted by the movie's droning score, and kept in suspense by every creepy and disturbing sequence, unable to predict the movie every step of the way. Upon rewatches, I found it to be the kind of movie that actually gets more frightening every preceding time, simply because you know what's going to happen next and there is no escape from it. Loosely based on Stephen King's novel, The Shining tells the story of a family who move into a secluded mountainside hotel as caretakers over the winter. As the days roll on, however, the family become privy to the hotel's dark past. Malevolent spirits show themselves in many forms to the young son, who has a gift called The Shining, and they play on the weak psyche of the father of the family, who becomes a victim of cabin fever, ultimately wishing to slaughter his family. In this role, my favourite screen performance ever, Jack Nicholson is spectacular. The greatest thing about The Shining, however, is that it seems to have an unreliable narrative. Throughout, we're never quite privy to all the information we feel we need in order to understand the story, and never quite know whether the spirits are real or are the manifestations of the rapidly declining mental health of the isolated family. Kubrick's direction is brilliant here, taking a less is more approach and refusing to give the audience the full story at every step of the way. And no matter whether you watch it as a legitimate horror movie taking it at face value, or watch it as a depiction of a psychological nightmare, you simply cannot deny that when The Shining gets its claws into you, there's no experience more terrifying. And at that, we've come to the end of another video. Do you agree with any of my ranking? Do you disagree with all of it? Fire away in the comments below and let me know your own personal rankings. But as always, stay civil, guys. No two personal rankings will ever be the same. If this is your first time viewing one of my videos, you like what you've seen, you'd like to see more like this in the future, then please don't forget to hit that big old subscribe button up on your screen right now, and also hit that like button down below if you're feeling extra generous. Also, don't forget to check out my many social media accounts, and please consider supporting me over on Patreon. Thanks for watching, guys, and I hope you have a wonderful day.